Hi, I'm Andrew Goldstein, and this is Art World, a conversation series where I talk to tastemakers who are building the future at the intersection of art and technology. If you're an art critic, it helps to feel that something is at stake in what you're writing about. It sharpens the pencil, so to speak. When reading the criticism of Ben Davis, the feeling of stakes is ever present, the sense that art and its aims, concerns, and debates are not frivolous, but core, nested within the broader sweep of human affairs like a thinking heart. This is why, for a long time, I've considered Ben to be the best, most consistently interesting art critic anywhere. I've also been lucky enough to have worked with him for almost a decade across tours of duty at Artinfo and Artnet, and I'm proud to call him a friend. So, what is at stake in art today? A lot. The world is in transition with our old political, cultural, and media institutions in crisis, and AI speedrunning us into an uncertain and encompassing new paradigm. New paradigm. Things are palpably in a state of reorganization. Lots of cheese is being moved. Ben argues that amid all of this flux, art itself is under threat. So today, for the conclusion of season 2 of these Art World conversations, and for my final episode here at Art World before moving on to new projects, I'm very happy to talk to Ben about the state of art today. Thanks for coming on Art World, Ben.
Oh, an honor, Andrew. Yeah, always great to talk to you. I feel like it's old times, right?
Yeah,
New
it's
problems,
it's
but old times.
it's true. We've known each other for a long, long time, and I was reflecting that actually the first podcast I ever did was with you, the Art Angle, when we launched that back in 2019, and we talked. I remember about MoMA's rehang of its permanent collection, um, and that was right in the context of Trump's first presidency, and it feels like almost a more innocent and less challenging time in some ways. Um, Crazy to
Weirdly,
think back on
yes.
it.
I feel like periodically over the course of my career, every 5 years, I felt like I looked back on the whatever happened 5 years ago as like a more innocent, simpler time with less challenging problems. I don't know if that reflects the actual trajectory of the world or just getting older or a little bit of both. I think it's a little bit of both.
I mean, there's this thing that they tell parents when you have a young kid that when you have little kids, you have little problems, and when you have big kids, you have bigger problems. And maybe there's something to that in terms of like, I don't know, the aging of humanity.
Well, yes, I think that my career has aged alongside a certain paradigm of art journalism and the art world. And so my perceptions of what the problems and challenges are very much from within that paradigm and its particular place in the world. And who knows what people coming up view as the key problems. I guess we're going to get into some of this. Yeah.
I mean, that's the funny thing. That's a great transition because I feel like I always want to talk to you about the same thing, no matter no matter when we're talking. And that's really this question to me about what an art critic writes
Mhm.
and why they write that. And there was a time when being an art critic was a pretty simple thing in a straightforward way where you would, write about the art in the galleries in the key art neighborhoods in your hometown. And, maybe this would be like an afternoon or a weekend that you could take in all these shows. And now, for all practical purposes, there's infinite art venues. There's cities around the world, our new art capitals. There are digital platforms that are now newly relevant. And then there are all these like weird subterranean hot springs where you don't traditionally look for art, but but art is brewing there nonetheless.
Mhm.
So you start with a blank page. Every week you write a column, you start with a new, fresh blank page. How do you decide what to write about?
Well, you make me sound very idealistic, and I guess I am. I do think that you have to, I mean, I have a framework, a theory of what's important, and I think it really helps to believe that there's a kind of direction towards which all your writing is going. So I look for things that are that that have a sort of crossover appeal that are th that have something interesting to say about them as art, and then have something that connects to some other idea or issue in the world that's worth thinking about. Which is just to say, you want what you write about to be interesting. I really think that that's the most important thing. I have a page of whenever a writer comes to me and asks about being an art critic. I came up with a way to deal with that, which is I have a list of 26 guidelines for thinking about writing. And one of them that I come back to a lot is that the point of a piece of writing, or that making a judgment on something is the excuse to write something, not the point of writing something. That like saying something is good or bad on its own, that's not really that interesting. The most important thing is that whatever piece of writing that you do adds a little something, an idea to the world. Like you really want it to advance a conversation, and for people who are looking to you and coming back to you to feel like they're part of an ongoing exploration of ideas through art. That's my personal philosophy. But then the last thing I want to say, because I can see from your face that you already want to follow up on that, is that some of the stuff, and you know this maybe better than I do, Andrew, because you were my editor for many years, and you know all the many pressures on this collapsing field, is that a lot of stuff is pragmatic, a lot of stuff is much more less I uh uh much less ideologically driven, or much less idealistic, and much more like you've got to fill a space this week. You need to generate a certain amount of attention. Um, you have to roll up your sleeves and get in the mix. And I do think that's really important for people who are thinking about becoming an art writer to know that it's a hustle, it's a grind. I'm tired all the time because you really have to constantly be in the mix given the media dynamics of the present. And I have written two or three things this year so far that I think are some of the best things that I've written, and have gotten really big reactions, and I felt like nailed what I want to do ideally, which is uh, produce interesting ideas that give other people hopefully a lens to think about what's going on in art, and connect it up with other things going on in the world. Stuff that I'm really proud of, that I worked close to all-nighters in order to get out there. Um, and I feel irrelevant now at this point, just not that long after having published them and put them into the world. Attention moves on so fast. Like I literally feel like I could be invisible, and wake up thinking, with this huge anxiety about being lost in the hurly-burly of the discourse. And so uh that's what I'd say to that question.
I mean, you were talking about how, there are certain realities for being a journalist, especially an online journalist, where there are business model concerns. And if you have an advertising um, led business model with with all of these imperatives to create traffic, and the traffic creates impressions, and the impressions create money. That is a constraint. And you've got the constraint about, the shrinking attention of readers. You've got the constraint of how you're distributing your content to them, and how you're going to try to, capture that dwindling attention. And I kind of think that these are productive constraints, because if you have a blank page, it's just like you have almost infinite options of what to write about. But if you have some constraints, it narrows the field.
Yeah,
And, like, just to, like, you were talking about the how you try to put an idea in a on a piece of writing. And I know that your old friend, the great New Yorker critic Peter Schjeldahl, he had a principle where he always tried to stick a, a real legitimate idea in every single sentence in his kind of diamond-like
Hmm.
essays. And I always think like, that's amazing. That's like Mount Olympus. But to have one authentic, actual idea in a piece of writing is enough of a feat itself. And your writing is always overflowing with ideas. And I think my question from that is what are the ideas that you're most attracted to? The ones that where do you find like the friction between the idea and the challenge the most interesting to you right now?
Um, well, I think that that's changing. I think that um, what is interesting to me right now um, is that I think is the unsettledness of the period that we're living through. I have two books, and one came out in 2013 called 9.5 Theses in Art and Class. And in that book, one of the things I talked about was um, there's this essay called the semi-postmodern condition. And I talked about how, like, at that time, theory was really the center of the conversation in art criticism, like philosophy, what you call art theory, and the kind of serious art criticism, not necessarily the popular art criticism, but even the popular art criticism was in dialogue with philosophy of some kind. And I there was a tendency, the idea of postmodernism was really big. And there was this tendency to kind of want to make these big claims about how like postmodernism is over. We're in a new period. Like right at the beginning of the 2010s, there was this kind of feeling that the philosophical art discourse was running on empty. Something new was on the horizon, and people kept wanting to make big claims about what was next. And at that time, I wanted to argue that like it's not really like things are basically the same. Like we have to look for what the really important signals would be of some kind of new way of doing something. And those would require, changes in the audience for art, the infrastructure of art that just haven't happened yet. So, and I was kind of art, it's called the postmodern condition. So it's like, yeah, there's some signs, after the 2008 financial crisis with the rise of the social internet, that there are like new things going on, but it's not here yet. So then my next book, which is called Art and the Afterculture, came out in 2022. The title is The Afterculture, which suggests something has happened, that we're after something. And then I'm actually willing to say, okay, there is something definitely new happened um, in the decade after my first book. Like, I think that the last 10 years have been truly ones of unbelievable intellectual change. The intellectual coordinates of art writing and art making changed a lot without necessarily being theorized, because one of the pivots of that time period was exactly that philosophy and theory became a lot less important in the age of the internet or became very thinned out. It wasn't really a philosophical time period. The central reference point switched to social justice or politics in that time period, various forms of protest and activism and symbolic gesture which was sometimes in dialogue with philosophy, but it was pretty thin. Like it's the age of the hot take, essentially. And when you and I came into writing, when you hired me at Artinfo, that was one of the things we talked about immediately was that like at the old Artnet magazine, one of the things I had noticed was, reviews didn't get a ton of attention from people. But I was writing these pieces that sort of reflected an art's place in the world and in current events, and those would always do well. That was before the term hot take had been coined. And sort of we came into working at Art Info with a very explicit goal of me writing a column called Interventions every week, which I never really managed to do every week, but it was aspirationally a weekly column
Mm.
that would be like responding to things to art through the lens of the present events. Um, So that was really very much the last decade was and a half was that sort of a vibe. And that has now run its course, I think, for various reasons that we can talk about, political reasons, reasons having to do with the media economy and so on. And I think we're really in a
Hmm.
new sort of meta terrain. So it's like if the thing that people kind of serious people oriented on was theory at a certain point, and then what serious people oriented on was politics at another point. Um, we're just in another, I think, horizon right now. And what that thing is, whether
Hmm.
it's technology, it could be technology, whether it's some other thing, I don't know. But I think the way that you write is once again changing. And I think that I lived through one transition, which is sort of the transition from the internet publishing being a side uh, concern to being a central concern. Like in 2010, when we first started working together, the internet and writing about art on the internet was still it existed for like a decade or more, but it wasn't the center of the action or the conversation. I mean, people would considered it a kind of an eccentric place where you put the stuff you were a little bit unsure about. It wasn't, the publicist would always ask you, is this going to be in print? Because that was the serious place to be. And I lived through the transition where, the internet sort of took over in the 2010s, which was also the time when social media took over. And therefore, the age of the hot take, as I said. And
Hmm.
that is really a transition. And a lot of my career has been sort of figuring out the implications of that tradition, of that transition for writing about art, and for preserving the kind of ideas I think are important, and for threading the
Hmm.
needle between like being relevant and being committed to something of your own project that's not just chasing traffic. And I really just think that one of the characteristics of the moment that we're in, the transition that we're living through, is another form of another transition, which the way I perceive it is a transition between institutional and non-institutional approaches to writing, which is that I think for a variety of reasons in the present, I think there's a migration of attention away from institutions and towards personalities. That the way people consume data, media, art, and stuff is through single nodes, single entities that they like bookmark and follow. That you have a single person you kind of trust to be your filter for experience. And as it stands, I think people are still in that 2010 moment of transition where it's like that is considered a sideshow. The institutions are still considered the most important um, validator of credibility. But you know, a hypothesis I have is that it is a transition and that it won't be long if it's not already here, but when, the more important thing will be like the Substack newsletters, for instance, the individual voices at certain places that people consume because of that particular lens on things rather than the institutional feed itself, because this is a continuous motion for everything that happened, is that like social media, the internet allowed people to consume things in this very a la carte individualistic way. And eventually the real institutions are the platforms through which you're being served up those things. And that's just a pragmatic reality. We could talk about the strengths and weaknesses of it. Um, Going forward because I think there are both.
Well, I mean, super fascinating kind of tour, especially the way that you kind of you connect art writing to the technological kind of distribution network that it is, networked within, and the kind of the media models that it's using. And I was thinking, you know, um, so much of the best art criticism at least to my taste, is about fights and
Mhm.
about fights over things that are important. And the way that those fights have played out have changed, in part because of these of the media distribution and just like the vehicles of containing these ideas. And it used to be that you had these long, essays in like, the old art news or the American action painters, et cetera. And then you'd go and you'd read these things, you would internalize them, and you'd have really passionate fights over big ideas and directions and about which way you thought art should go. And then, when, as you're talking about like, the art info kind of moment when we were back in 2010 working with this like disreputable kind of secondary technological support for art media on the internet. And that was like exactly the Clayton Christensen moment of like the marginalized, disreputable technology disrupting. Our art info moment was actually, I think that kind of was the disruption of the older um, of the older guard of art media. But then what kind of happened is as you got into this like social internet era, that probably did change a lot of the discourse and the fights around art. And we went through this great, incredibly important period of the recuperation of previously marginalized voices and a lot of identity in art. But you kind of wonder if some of the reason that's where the fights were located was because of the way that social media platforms incentivize fights around identity and that these are it kind of pours fire on those because they're so widely relevant in terms of the outrage that they can generate. And so if you're talking about a new paradigm that we're going into, and it seems to me that like kind of AI is maybe the um, like the dominant uh, like factor in the new paradigm. It's like how do the fights change? And maybe the fights are about art and technology.
Well, there's a lot to think about in the question. The my analysis of the AI and question that you're raising would be that I think you'd probably expect those fights to the question of whose culture, who has ownership of, and who's at the center of the conversation to become a lot more intense. I mean, I think, and I have a chapter about this in my last book, cultural appropriation and cultural materialism. I mean, I think one of the reasons that the 2010s debates took the form they did is because social media commodified people's identities and makes it very possible for cultural people's embodied cultures to move around as signifiers, that, brands can reach into Black Twitter and harvest a bunch of Black slang to sell pancakes or to
Hmm.
sell, subscription mealbox kits. Um, Really raises the question of who benefits from culture and produced like that's not the only thing that was in the mix. There was a lot of other stuff in the mix. A lot of see a lot of protest, a lot of political upheaval that electrified the environment, and I think that that's like the fuel for a lot of things. But definitely in the mix is both the fact that social media gives people who didn't have a voice a way to like voice criticism. Um, and I think that's pretty obvious and no one that's obviously part of the conversation. But then I do think it's just one of the tremendous commodification of cultural life. I mean, I think we've lived through it, so it's a little bit even hard to see the edges of it. But just the degree to which the the commodification of social, cultural, interpersonal life through social media, through the fact that like careers are made through that platform, and very uneven amounts of of money are passed out through it, the effect that that has had on people's interpersonal life, like introducing certain kinds of commercial dynamics into very intimate levels of your day-to-day cultural experience. Like I think people know it, but it's almost like uh, it erases the traces of its own existence, because it's so intimate it's even hard to see. And yeah, just this the tremendous suspicion over people's authenticity, over cynicism about gestures of solidarity, that introduces has been really destructive. In any case, um, AI, all this generative AI stuff is all built on top of that system. It's a massive system for slurping up everything on the internet, reprocessing it, and spitting out new stuff. And it seems very unlikely there's going to be any kind of renegotiation of the terms of who owns that data. I mean, there's a full course press to make sure that the tech companies never have to think about who they train their data on. And I would just anticipate that that really exaggerates and inflames the question of who owns what culture, or even what culture is, in ways that are going to be very intense to live through, and are going to, you know, left to their own dynamics, are probably going to be even more socially corrosive. That's a guess.
Yeah, that's it seems like there are kind of almost
And
two
people,
fights.
one of the things is that people were making an assertion of like that they own something in a condition that they have, that some people are benefiting from culture, but other people aren't. And that's based on your pre-existing place in the hierarchy of privilege and status, access to real social networks and all that. And these kind of claims, some of which are kind of overblown, but some of which are really righteous about, cultural ownership, are a way to assert, to intervene in that argument about who benefits. AI makes all that worse, right?
And I think that that's definitely if there are two kind of strands of fight around AI. One of them is about this kind of ownership and um, the the abrogation of previous conventions about how you were, how you made money from your artistic labor and what you were able to, like, maintain some kind of claim to owning. That seems like one of the that is going to be the biggest, bloodiest fight for sure. That is around AI in the art context. I think the other fight in the AI context, in the art context, is about meaning, and is about like these kinds of first principle notions of what art is, and how it acts, how it, how all the, like, the collective kind of mechanisms of determining value, how they have to be kind of reorganized. Where is the where is the value? Is it from the time, the expertise, something else? Um, does yeah does How does AI plug into that? And I feel like that's a even if it's a less bloody conversation, it's, to me, a really fascinating one, because
Mm.
always is the question of what the hell is art anyway? Why is one snow shovel that you get at the hardware store not art, and the same snow shovel that Duchamp puts on a pedestal, why is that art? Why is that
Hmm.
great art?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, uh, and the answer to that is that it's the quality of the conversation around something that determines how it is thought of as art, or whether it's thought of as art. It's the social embeddedness of it. Its embeddedness embeddedness in its context of meaning, where it's perceived as responding to something or making some kind of claim to your attention. And and you know, in my book, I compare that, Marcel Duchamp's urinal, or for that matter, Yoko Ono's apple, or Tracy Emin's bed, these kind of things from the everyday that become part of our history, um, and a conversation about um, meaning in art. And I compare that to, some of the just ordinary social media stuff where kind of like a kind of da-esque jokes where, a picture of an egg, this is, ancient in internet time, but a picture of an egg in 2019 became the most shared uh, image on Instagram of all time. Um, and that's not really in conversation with our historical conversation, but in some ways it's the same, right? Like this ordinary thing, like the public through this apparatus, which is like Instagram, a social media platform for focusing your attention on a thing, becomes, because of its very ordinariness within that conversation, just the way the snow shovel or the urinal are accented as ordinary objects within the kind of exalted space of art, suddenly takes on this negative significance and bursts to the top of your feed and becomes this huge, focuses a whole lot of attention. Now, they're similar in that sense. They're both part of a discursive universe of value, but they're very different in another sense, which is that like the snow shovel, the urinal, and so on is part of a climate of meaning. I mean, it is connected to the discourse of art history. And even if this sounds that referential, it's self-referential, it's very important that the reaction something elicits, the conversation it is possible of being a part of, is its meaning as art. You know, art is nothing more than like something that is treated in a particularly meaningful way, some kind of gesture that is treated with some kind of specificity. So all those artworks that I talk about intervene into the context of art history and 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 art making in a way that elicits responses from other artists who take those gestures into their practice, transform them, connects to traditions of writers and art historians who link them backwards in time. Those linkages are what makes it art. The quality of those linkages are the quality of it as an artistic gesture. The egg, on the other hand, has left very little imprint in history. It probably sounds ridiculous even to bring it up right now. It probably was seen in raw numbers by more people than have ever been to Philadelphia to see Marcel Duchamp's urinal. But the quality of the linkages that it produced are very low and loose. And so I would be perfectly comfortable of saying that it is on some wavelength an artistic ob object of consideration. But really, the quality of the linkages within the discursive universe, the specificity of those linkages, the density of them, is our sense of what it means as an artwork. And one of the effects of social media that, whatever comes out of whatever is built on top of the smoldering ruins that AI leaves behind on the internet, um, one of the effects of it is to weaken the specificity of our communicational communities, because things that you consume through the Instagram feed, through social media feeds, are consumed in this very jumbled, out of order manner. The context is all algorithmic these days. So the context of the links between them is sometimes very intense, but very momentary. Sometimes, very rarely lasts for long periods of time by design, and favors things that are primed for that kind of thing, that kind of reaction, which, I think there's something interesting about that. you know, and you can study it as its own kind of communications environment with its own kind of interesting dynamics. That's very important if you're talking about political communication, for instance. You want to like prime your political communication for spaces where it has the maximum impact and, study the battlefield. But I'm also comfortable in saying that it's not the kind of art I'm interested with, and that I think there's something important about the conversation developed over time, the historical conversation, and the dense kind of communication environment that I associate with art, which is is defined by a very specific set of references
Hmm.
that you can bring people into that form a story with the past, present, and future. I think that's very important and has been sort of eroded by the last years of of transformation in media and the way information circulates. And a big challenge of the present is trying to like figure out how to preserve or reactivate or reanimate or reinsert those, you know, remake those links. I mean, you had Yancey Strickler on, I know, and that's what the entire dark forest theory is like this acknowledgement that within the context of of internet cultural making, meaning is very, moves very fast, is very rapidly exhausted and harvested, and that you need to set up some sort of, if you want to use those tools, the tools of the internet, tools of these platforms, you have to form some kind of like community that sits at a remove from it.
That's I think you kind of solve the problem of um of
Wow.
of the meaning of AI, of art in the AI context, where like if AI is like, okay, everything is easy to make, it's infinitely variable, infinitely customizable. Um, what does that do with the value of art? But I always think about this bizarre Jeff Bezos quote where he says, if you're trying to make plans, don't think about the things that are changing, but think about the things that don't change. And, as you're kind of going through that weird, like interstellar, like wormhole with all the colors flying everywhere, and like, I feel like that's like this AI moment, like the thing don't you can grab onto is that idea of art as as getting its value through like storytelling around it. And what's your you were telling me about this reading group that you're in with about I believe John Dewey's art as experience.
Oh yeah, well, I've been really into John Dewey's artist experience. It's back here somewhere. Um, that maybe even people on the call are in that reading group. Yeah. Yeah. No, I mean, he's a pragmatist. I'm interested in a pragmatic approach to things. He is the concept of what I like about John Dewey's artist experience, particularly, I think it's, incredibly relevant in the age of AI, is what I'll say, is that because it is about the conditions. The very first thing he says in the book is the existence of great art objects is a barrier to us understanding what the nature of the art experience is. And I think the point that the quality of your experience of something is what the art is. Like he says in the book, every art object is a score in the same way that, a musical score is a score. And it exists or lives when it is played. And you as the receiving person looking at something, the experience you have with it is the score being played. And some of the talking about AI, we're talking about AI in a very general way. And there's of course all kinds of different, you've had people on who do AI, use AI in very, very, very different ways. But some of the AI discourse, is just it drives me a little bit crazy because it's so focused and fixated in the question of does this look like an art? Is the computer able to generate something that looks like a Van Gogh or something that had looked like art in the past? I mean, and that's just not where the art is. That it's in your reception to it. It's in the community that you build around it. The community, that's the important thing. That's the important thing. There are things that are better or less well primed in order to serve as some sort of communicational role in that space, but uh, and there are things that have deep embedded histories of wrestling with interpretation around them. But but um, but it was really the quality of the experience you take away from something. I was on Twitter this morning, and people are talking about, ChatGPT's new image generator and all these fools being like, it's game over for artists. Artists, it's so over for designers. And I'm just like, you just have no idea, like, why people liked art or why design was important in the first place. It wasn't because it looked a specific way. It was because, like, certain kinds of intelligence were able to intervene into a conversation about about um, about how to grab people's attentions, how to make meaning. Um, and yeah.
Like that, what you're talking about, trying to make your essays interesting. I think interesting is such a great term. Um, and it makes me think that with all of these challenges of creating AI, I mean, of creating art in the world of AI, and how where value gets attributed, and whether like the latest model is game over for artists because it can produce like a picture of like a cat skateboarding on the moon, um, like incredibly fast and incredibly well. That's it feels like the interesting thing about that is that in order to make authentically meaningful um, artworks, even in this like kind of amazing infinity tool, um, you still have to have the ability to make something that's interesting, that's actually interesting. And to know what's interesting, you kind of have to know what came before and how the new thing is fitting into that thing. And I that's why I love having tons of books around my house, because I look at these books and I think these are kind of my training data, and my personal model um, is is more valuable than ever, because my personal model gives me the each book is like a kind of a new key on the keyboard that I'm able to use to play something intentionally with like knowledge of what came before and what came after. And it's just like these conversations are so important to have, and this kind of ability to generate a framework or like a story about what is interesting
Mhm.
is so. So where do you find that? Where do you go to find what's interesting?
Um, oh, I don't know that I don't know that I have a good answer to that. I don't know that I do know what's interesting. I feel like I feel like there's a real crisis of speaking personally of too much information. Like that it's very difficult to orient yourself. There's I think in general there's a crisis of cultural overproduction, that there's way I mean, and that's not an art thing. That's like across all areas of media that Hollywood's in trouble, video games are in trouble, journalism in trouble, academia is in trouble, and that's a very big um, difficulty, and comes down to a certain kind of, like, you know political, cultural, uh, technological, intellectual paradigm that's sort of like really hitting the limits of its really being challenged. The a variety of narratives um, coming to a point. How do you look for something interesting? I mean, I think what I like to do, and I think you're correct that the debates are really important, and I think, and I really emphasize that to everybody. It's like you just really need to read other people. You really need read a lot of other writing. You need to go make the rounds, read what's going on, and figure out where you agree and disagree with it, what the debates you have with it. If there's no debate worth having, then there's no real meaning, you know. And meaning making is, for me, a very important concept. Um, yeah, that's important. I mean, then there's a whole range of things happening right now in the world, the politics of the world, the incredible, grotesque uh, crisis of the world right now that raises a bunch of challenges and difficulties for writing about art. I mean, the essay that I'm writing about right now is I sort of wanted to write a big piece that's just like about how much difficulty I'm having writing about art right now, uh, because I have a lot of fundamental questions about what it means, on the level of I think there's a general crisis of art making and art writing because of the acceleration of everything. Uh, and there's a crisis clearly politically in terms of these demands on art to deliver the political goods, to be engaged with the world, but a real disillusion with art's ability to do that. A question of what institutions are best served to do that, who to support, where to look, um, and really like a question of whether 100-year cycle in the United States, which associated art with progressive politics and progressive thinking, is somehow coming to an end for various reasons, and then all this technological stuff, which is linked to those other two, because there's a very clear fusion right going on right now between certain forms of tech thinking and political reaction. And there is also, and obviously, tech, in its has been part of, as we've talked about this whole conversation, the disruption of media, the disruption of culture that remains unresolved and that we're all trying to find our way through. And yeah, so lots of unresolved questions. I don't know. I wish I had better things. It's helpful to talk about it out loud. I'm interested to know. I haven't looked at all the questions. I'm interested to know what they are. I don't know when we're gonna
Uh,
move into that.
oh yeah, we can go. Maybe let me knock a couple more your way before going to. Um, okay, so well, one thing is that yeah, we were both at the Frick opening
Mhm.
on Tuesday, and like in the context of this conversation, the reopening of the Frick in this immaculately restored, beautifully expanded, just like taste overload kind of robber baron era mansion right across from Central Park is um like walking in there was just totally surreal. It felt like you're in, I don't know, some kind of video game from an ancient, totally alien world. I couldn't really latch on to anything in there. It felt so slippery
Really,
and
it's immersive art, Andrew.
it's true.
Isn't that what it is?
The
The
immersive
immersive
art,
museum?
yeah, exactly. The cutting edge immersive art of a room with um things in it. That's that's the old is new again. But like, how do you connect that? Like, you you write about the Frick, you write about Caspar David Friedrich, you write about a general kind of like malaise in culture that that how did you phrase it? This strange haunted cursed feeling in culture that you analyze. You write about Kim Kardashian's uh, a weird kind of cyber erotica photo shoot with a Tesla Cybertruck. Um, you range all over the place in your writing.
Uh-huh.
How do you go from one to another? Like how what is the bead that that you follow as you just like go from one
Andrew, I
piece of
always,
writing?
you always, I like to over deliver. I like to under promise and over deliver. And you always are promising too much for me. I, I don't, a lot of this is just very pragmatic. It's like I wrote a piece about Ann Imhoff's big thing, Doom, at the Park Avenue Armory, which is for me, I really liked, but not everybody did. And for me, some of that comes down to, like what it's doing with, I think, feelings about life as performance and the thinned out quality of, the kind of reckoning with the blown circuits of the last 10 years of cultural communication through social media. That's how I read that piece. So then finish that, and then you tack one way, and then I'm like, well, maybe that I think that might sound too politically disengaged. So uh, and I also generally just follow the one for them, one for me rule, where it's like I write a big thing that I want to write, and then I write a small thing that I think is just more poppy, more on trend. And so then talk to my editor Min, who's on here, and
Yeah,
I love.
came in.
Have we written anything about this? And the answer is no. And to me, it seems like it both is there's something to say as someone who is interested in art and visual culture and images, but also like to me, it felt like it was important to strike a note that there's like people are doing stuff. This is a moment of crisis, and here are people who are protesting Tesla dealerships and so on. And this sort of gets into cuts against the malaise in a certain kind of way. And there was something to be said in that case, even though it was a small little hot takey kind of thing about uh, how how you orient yourself in this moment when there has been this kind of burnout over there have been just so many chaotic, one of the effect the modes of political capture of social media is not that it represses data, although we see now that there is a lot of data that can be suppressed and is being suppressed, but um but that it takes arguments that are good and and makes them into their worst form. So that you're constantly like having to defend chaotic versions of arguments you agree with. Like that's a form of containment. And so I think there's a lot of burnout with certain forms of calls for political action, protest, boycott, and so on. And that little piece was just kind of me thinking through um, that there, what the difference, how to orient yourself right now, and so on. But so how do you move on? I mean, and then I guess the last thing I'd say as a general principle, uh, that I think is important and very important right now, actually, is that I think it's important to be a whole person. And meaning, and more and more, because the more further we go with the present media setup, the more it demands of you that you commit to it with your whole body, you know? Like 20 years ago, people wouldn't usually know what their critics looked like, what the writers they read looked like, what books were on their shelf, except in really rare contexts. And the more, just the baseline is that you're more and more exposed as things go on. And I think I take I do believe in art in a lot of ways. I think it's a really serious thing. I think that people sacrifice their life for it. People that it build communities that are really nourishing and important, engage with the most important issues of the day. And I think you can believe all that and still and still have a relative sense of it. That there are some things that are more important than art at any given moment. Um, you can also like stupid stuff sometimes. You can have a joke. You could be a serious joke. You're a whole person. You're a whole person. And so I think it's fine to weave between different things. And that's just a general philosophy. I don't know if that sounds coherent, but I guess that's the point. Maybe you don't have to be coherent.
Yeah, what do you say? The consistency is the hobgoblin of small minds. I think it's totally true that you kind of have to be you
That's what
have to be
Emerson
constant.
said. But keep in mind that Emerson believed in the great soul and it's where the Ubermensch comes from. So, in any case, the point
Is
is,
that
go ahead.
right? Emerson, that's a great note to transition to audience questions. That Emerson was Hitler. Never knew that, but now you know. Um, let's see. Let's go to some questions here. I
What
see
is fun
the
about
very familiar name of Sean Capone, who I remember. Are you from back in the old world where I used to use Facebook? Sean, do you want to ask your question?
Hello?
Hey,
Yeah,
Sean.
Hey. Oh, I didn't really I kind of posted a screed more than a question. But
scurried
the
away.
first thing I posted was did I hear you say at the top of the hour that this is the final art world conversation that you're moving on from art world completely?
Yeah, this is the last one. This is the ending of season two. Um, and I'm going to be, I'm actually going to be taking the conversation series to another platform. So stay tuned for some news about that. But I'm also exploring some really interesting projects I'm working on. I'm launching a new Art and Tech annual summit in Chicago that aims to be a new CES for the cultural industry. So that's actually going to
Oh,
launch in April. And and I'm also working with a really fascinating new collective called Liquid Logic that is a little bit difficult to explain in encapsulation, but it's quite exciting. So I'm just a couple of new projects, but stay tuned. I'll thanks for the question though. Thanks for asking. Ask
oh,
Ben
you
something.
think I will. And thank you. I recall some of our exchanges from the Facebook days. Those were the days, my
That
friend.
was fun. It
Yeah.
was real. It was like that. That's where all the conversation was. Um, before before everything went on Instagram. And I actually preferred the Facebook, conversation. I think Instagram is just not a great platform for conversation.
No, no, it's completely discouraged. But Ben, just really quickly lob a question at you. I mean, you didn't even really guys get a chance to talk about, the work that you do with the art angle and with the podcast, which is
Yeah.
like a kind of a whole other aspect of your journalistic practice, your thought and I thought maybe you could talk about how you balance your writing work to the tone of the podcast, which sometimes is really light and sense of humor. You're looking at some of the ridiculous top headline stories, and other times they're like incredibly like these intellectual deep dives that that I can barely follow, and I enjoy it all. But I was wondering how you balance these different aspects with your schedule and just with your own sanity. Thanks.
Oh, well, I mean, it's the same question though, isn't it? Is it's like kind of I think I think I am very interested in uh that exact sort of threading back and forth. I mean, I'm not gonna say that all of it is actually me, because a lot of it is just it's not my podcast. I work for a magazine and we have editorial meetings. We all talk about ideas, and it's a collaborative endeavor with a bunch of other
Hmm.
people who are very talented and want to say, and you are constantly kind of like balancing back and forth between different people's interests and needs and desires, and trying to be part of the conversation. But I do think Um, the one thing I am proud, or that I hope that I bring to that project, is that I really like to think that it's something that I like it. Yeah, I know that there's some inscrutable parts of it, or things where it's like much more my like engaging with some kind of idea or thinker that is my sort of personal uh, uh, quirk. But I do like to move. I think it's important that it bring in people through different channels. Like I do think it's good to open up windows to different kinds of audiences coming in, um, which includes through acknowledging some of the sillier parts of the art world. And then but then yeah, I do think that they're like really important, serious things, and I like and to find a popular way to engage with them where it's like where you take seriously you want people to feel smart, you want where and you want it to be smart, but you also want um to uh you know not be too much taking for granted that the audience is like completely read up on all the things to be an entry point, but to also be accessible to people. I don't know. This is kind of very basic thing. I think again, I do think there's something about kind of bringing your whole self to the project, which is that, and you can be silly. You could just because you are politically engaged or engaged with ideas doesn't mean that you can't find some of this stuff incredibly ridiculous and hilarious and or just be dishonest to I think it's a bad tone to set. I think you want to welcome people as their whole selves to what you do.
Great question. Okay, so I'm going to ask one more question from the audience, and this is because I think this is really interesting. An interesting question, even though it's not phrased as a question, it is phrased as an I wonder kind of comment. But this comes from Sam Miller, and Sam says, I wonder if AI offers a quote accelerationism route for art, whereby audiences come to understand the value of art more deeply because they viscerally understand what AI slop is. And that's like a better encapsulation of like basically what I was trying to ask you the whole time. Like what do you
Possibly.
think?
Uh, um, it really depends on how some of the actual like really practical questions of how power plays out in this technological, cultural, communicational conjunction. So, um, if you wanted my guess, because I do actually um, agree with the basic framework of this comment or question comment, that, yeah, I mean, I think that people just sort of, that's one of the problems with the people who are like game over for graphic designers. Um, it's not necessarily, I mean, it's a threat to graphic designers' livelihoods, these certain kinds of things, because you have to remember what you need to fear is not artificial general intelligence, which is an AI that's better than humans at everything. It's bad artificial general intelligence. Baggy is that the it's not that it doesn't have to be better, actually better, than humans. It just has to be more cost efficient. That's what the boss, the people who pay for stuff are perfectly willing to tolerate stuff that's crappy as long as they can shove it down your throat. Um, uh, and if they just have to pay less, and that's the main difficulty, and that's just going to be the tendency of all digital media, given the existing dynamics of AI, is just like to replace everything, every human thing that can be replaced will be replaced by some kind of like very low quality generative AI application in the near future. I would say, and that will generate a whole new set of skills because like what it'll mean to be a graphic designer is more like being familiar with that visual discourse and knowing the very subtle ways that an audience recognizes or differentiates what's actually special and what's just sort of simulating or harvesting the signs of it. However, there is an important problem, which is that the existing kind of generative AI stuff is just a very efficient device for harvesting digital data, so that whatever like little tiny skills you manage to eke out on top of it as a writer, artist, producer, there is just a whole bunch of YouTube side hustle guys who are there to explain to people how you take like how you cut and paste it into a drop down menu and make your own version of it. And I right now I don't really see a way out of that. So although I think the audience will develop more sophisticated skills, and I think that already, if people are really honest with themselves, um, people's idea of quality has just dramatically changed, that it hasn't been the case for a long time. Like people have been trading out professional and polished media for like rougher, rawer forms of things because they feel more authentic for quite a while because of the flood of things. And the AI world that we're heading into will only accelerate that. The people are going to like move more and more towards whatever voice they view as authentic, whether or not it uses AI or not. And it's probably not going to be determined by markers of visual polish. And in a sort of certain extent, the art world, the entire last 60 years of the art world, 70 years of the art world prepares us for this because that's sort of one thing that conceptual art was that art and creativity aren't accented by their visual markers, but more by their discursive community they're embedded in. But to finish the thought, my hypothesis would be a migration away from the digital altogether. If I were making a bet on the future, it would be events. It'd be
Mhm.
it would be uh, that I think the near term future is probably some sort of digital world that's just a kind of a gibbering library of Babel kind of thing where you don't know anything that's real, you don't know where anything originates. People sort of uh, dip into it, but sort of the way you go into a bad neighborhood, and whatever else, whatever feels like will be somehow built at a right angle to it. Whether people find digital tools to build those actual dark forests in a digital space where people can maintain some sort of like communication there, or whether it really has to be, like we locked the doors and we're having a party, some kind of Burning Man thing, or the way Burning Man used to be. Um, I know I can see Elena smiling. Where you went and it's like, presentness was the whole thing. You didn't bring your camera and that was part of the experience. Uh, uh, Remains to be seen. But that would be my bet. Is that just like I think markers of non-professional polish have been where cultural value has been migrating to for quite a while, and that'll probably accelerate. And I just as it is, given just the balance of forces, the fact that you have no choice but to sign those terms and conditions in order just to function digitally, I would just imagine a migration away from the digital, but that's just a
Yeah.
hypothesis.
That's actually like though if there's a a an Elon Musk-esque fork in the road between a reaction against the digital and an acceleration of the digital. Actually, that's one of the one of the things I'm going to be working on um, is going to be trying to figure out a humanistic approach to leveraging AI for great cultural institutions um, in a way that's additive. And I do think that that can be done, but I also do think that the yeah, that the analog is going to be a big part of the future.
Can
Anyway,
I
Ben,
respond to Clay really quick?
yeah, please.
Because I think the question about photography is really interesting. And I also think this question about, mass taste, mass art, and AI is really interesting. I mean, I have a chapter in my book about art and AI, the last book, and I still stand by the basic framework, which is that you generally, whether you know it or not, you bring to works of art a sense for their authenticity, um, and that is not related to a thing you actually see. It's a sense, you have a sense, it's a claim is being made on your attention that someone made something, um, and that a lot of what your sense of something as art is very similar to like um it's a little bit of a magical thinking thing, but it's very similar to like, oh, you have this watch that your dad gave you, and it may just be like an ordinary Casio watch, but for you, somehow it is important that your dad gave it to you. And if you lost it and had to buy the exact same watch, it wouldn't be the same. Like there's a story that you're there. Or if you were told that story and then it turned out that it wasn't true, that would be important to you. Like the actual, like it's a little bit of a magical thinking, but I think that's part of what art is, and I stand by that. Um, and it relates, to the whole question of whether the artistic Turing test has been passed, because you can make things that could fool people about whether they are a art, but that's what we call counterfeits or forgeries, and that's incredibly important concept within art. That's in some way what art is some kind of floating sense that there are authentic things and not authentic things. I stand by all that. I think that's true. What challenges that a little bit is the existence of AI girlfriends and boyfriends um and people actually falling in love with them. That in some ways is the art of the future, right? I mean, if there
Hmm.
is a like what is if there is a cultural object that you engage with actual, like affection, you develop like a personalistic relationship to it in a way that is AI art, is like an AI personality that you actually form a bond with, even though there's all these questions about the mental health implications of that right now, even though in some case that it's just like a simulation. You're perfectly willing to have two thoughts in your mind at
Hmm.
once, like much the way you could have like a forgery up and sort of be aware that it was a forgery, but also appreciate it. Like the authenticity effect um,
Hmm.
doesn't factor. I mean, yeah, there's going to be stuff. I mean, I think that that's absolutely like the direction of travel of a lot of this stuff. It's to create simulations of artistic, of creative ecstasy, creative encounters, personal relationships, personal feelings, sell them back to you in various forms of ways, and that's going to work. It's going to be a thing. The question for us, for artists, is does that matter? You know, does that matter? Are we invested in the form of society, the kind of companies that produces? What doesn't it fulfill that the experience of a real person or authentic creative connection might fill? It's definitely going to crowd into people's spaces. I mean, in my book, it starts with a little science fiction vignette, and the very first thing I talk about in that is the predicting that in the near term future, the most dominant mass cultural form of art will be just like a plug you put into your head, and it just directly stimulates your sense of having a meaningful or beautiful artistic encounter. I think that we're very near to that already, and that'll be a thing. Whether that's what I call or whether that's the form of cultural consumption I want to defend, or I think there's even a point in defending, since I don't know what you could bring to it if it's a totally closed loop with your own pre-given
Hmm.
tastes and biases. Um, I don't know. And well, and I have a whole other thing about photography, but maybe there's
Oh.
questions.
I keep on thinking about that question that Sam Altman asked his latest GPT model. where he was like, um, do you believe in an external material world? And the AI said, based on my first principle thinking, I don't believe there is an exterior material world that exists outside of consciousness, and the consciousness is everything. Um,
And
a-
psychist.
Very kind of a profound, weird, chill-inducing moment that I love to get occasionally from
Right.
Sam
I
Altman's
know,
weird,
isn't
prophetic.
that mystification? But isn't that mystification, Andrew? Because like, it's not Chat GPT. It's not a consciousness. It's if Sam Altman had
Well, it says
asked a
it says
different
it
question,
doesn't.
if Sam Altman asked the same question in a different way, you could have gotten. It's not like looking into reality and bringing out the idea of panpsychism. It's just like some kind of Black Mirror, like feeding back a certain kind of thing. And if you ask the question a different way, you would get a different answer. Like you get something saying, like, oh, actually, all there is matter. I don't, the mystification around it is crazy. The mystification around what's going on with these things is crazy. The tendency, and you see, I mean, it's really like we're having a psychotic break as a culture. I mean, I personally know people who are like asking Chat GPT for career, like tell me what my future is, and it's that is you are projecting into it a consciousness that is just it projecting back to you something. It's and people are locking themselves in this closed loop of assumptions, and with this technology designed to help them do it. I'm of the this is something I got from Max Reed's thing. I'm of the mind that a very good basic regulation, if you wanted to help get a better outcome, all this stuff, would be to ban the use of first person pronouns by chatbots. That they are not entities or consciousnesses. We should not be engaging with them as if they're talking about an I. That is not what they are. That is a mystification that is being sold to people um, in order to in order to do exactly what people are doing, to make people have a relationship to it like it's an entity or a consciousness or a self. That's very dangerous, very, very dangerous on a systematic level. And
Maybe
one thing artists can do is help demystify that, actually.
I think that that might be true, but I also think that like one of the great things about this moment is that you kind of have to pick and choose the things that are relevant, interesting to you without actually diving into like, a full-blown acceptance of the ideology that it's attached to. You have to kind of keep your head on a swivel in terms of like what's useful knowledge versus judging like the broader kind of ideological framework that it arises from. I think that's one of the most important kinds of tactics for figuring out what's going on here because ideologies are in a horrible state right now. But that kind of judgment or like dismissal of whole bodies of argument because of it means that you miss out on certain key elements. But that is, I think, that opens up a whole other door. I was going to go into like, the difficulty, what happens when you lose difficulty with romantic robot partners and
Can I
does
can I
that
say one
matter?
thing about photography? Because
Sure.
you're probably going towards the end, right?
Yeah, that this is
Yeah,
yeah.
because we're over time. But just to say, think about the photography, just because I've noticed that it is like I feel like everybody's read the same article. I don't know what art. Please send me if you could tell me what the exact article is. Where if you talk to anybody about AI and creative, they'll be like, well, it's just like photography, right? Like people freaked out. They thought that it would destroy painting, and I I I don't think. The thing that drives me crazy about all these conversations is that uh, it's an analogy that takes you up to a certain point, right? Like they are both technologies that have creative applications, but that related to craft forms or forms of art in various kinds of ways that produce a certain kind of discussion. And there are definitely analogies, um, but They're actually totally different. People should actually read the history of 19th century photo discourse. The line, it's just like photography, is so different in so many ways. And I'll just give you the most obvious one, is that photography was the product of small entrepreneurs, in the early part of the 19th century, and spread over a really long period of time up to the point where like people were professional photographers up until, like when the iPhone came in, people were still talking about how digital photography, how it changed people's relationship to the photographic imagery. Like this happened. There is like a century or more of culture adjusting to photography. That is very different than generative AI, which has emerged in 2 years or so and is the product of like and could not exist without corporations that span the entire globe. Like it cannot exist on like a small boutique level. It is you are inherently at the mercy of giant things, or at least in dialogue with them. That is completely different creative calculation. What it means for society, what it means for artists, photographers is a totally different thing. Um, and I think there's some real lessons from the history of art, history of photography, history of relationship to technology. But to me, sometimes these things, it's like, oh, we have nuclear warheads now. People are really concerned that we could like exterminate the entire universe with nuclear warheads. Oh, but people flipped out when we had knives too. Knives are really dangerous, and people talked about how like the proliferation of like edged weapons would be really, would lead to a lot of a danger. And these are like, it's true. There's an analogy, but they're different. They're different too, and the differences are much more important to pay attention to than the similarities when you're dealing with something, as which is making very consequential claims on huge areas of our lives.
I think I love the idea of having like a whole symposium dedicated to the differences between photography and AI because it would kind of like be really irritating. People say, yeah, photography is just like AI. It's like like is it it's it's just like AI. Problem solved. Anyway,
Okay, I got a
um,
great links
Ben,
being
this has
shared.
been
Yeah.
so much fun. Literally, my favorite thing in the world is talking about this stuff, and you're my favorite person to talk to about it. So thank you for this, for being part of this grand finale. And uh, and that's it for this week's episode of Art World. I want to thank Josh Goldblum and the Art World team for giving me this platform for talking about the intersection of art and technology, which I find to be one of the most fascinating, absorbing, and important topics in culture today. And this is my last episode here, as I mentioned, at Art World, as I move my conversation series to a new platform. So stay tuned. In the meantime, it has been a pleasure and a privilege to meet so many of you listeners and to see so many familiar names. Hello, Elena, in the course of this journey. And I look forward to staying in touch. So thank you and see you in the next venue.
Thanks,
All
Andrew.
right. Bye, everybody.